Hey, what's up guys? As always, I hope you're doing well. This video will be an speculative biology analysis on the physiology of the kaiju that we can see in Pacific Rim, in which we'll try to explain the different adaptations and characteristics of these creatures. With that said, let's get some context. Pacific Rim is an action and science fiction film that combines elements relatively rare in big Hollywood films. Robots and giant monsters beating the hell out of each other, something more typical of anime. And although this premise is more than enough to entertain, there is also a plot. The story revolves around humanity's desperate attempts to defend itself against what is seen at first as a mysterious invasion of colossal creatures, the kaiju, monsters with variable characteristics that emerge from the depths of the Pacific Ocean and that are quite difficult to bring down with conventional weaponry. In response to these attacks, humanity makes a joint effort to create weapons capable of matching the invaders literally and figuratively, and thus the Jaegers were born. Anthropomorphic weapon platforms specially designed to face the kaiju, machines as massive as they are complex, which must be piloted by two people in such a way that each functions as one cerebral hemisphere. Despite their initial success and popularity, the Jaegers eventually prove insufficient to defend humanity for the simple reason that they cannot keep up with the increasing intensity of the attacks. For this reason, these giant machines are beginning to be sidelined in favor of an enormous perimeter wall surrounding the main coastlines on all continents, a barrier that supposedly would be capable of stopping the monsters at the shores. As you can imagine, this strategy does not work out very well. Not only do the attacks become progressively more frequent and start to follow a distinct pattern, but the monsters themselves continue to grow larger and larger to the point that they can simply breach the wall. The truth is that the arrival of the kaiju is, of course, not a natural phenomenon. They are not actually inhabitants of planet Earth that came from the ocean depths, but rather a force of invasion and terraforming sent from another universe. Biological weapons created by a mysterious faction known as the Precursors, who engineered these enormous creatures not only to decimate the human population but also to alter Earth's ecosystems. When it comes to the anatomy and the physiology of these creatures, probably the first aspect that draws attention is that they are polyphenic life forms. This means that regardless of their anatomical differences, they are nonetheless genetically identical. They are a species that, despite possessing the same genetic information, can present radically different physical traits between individuals. Now, on the surface, these may sound strange. Identical genes should produce identical traits, but the truth is that this is not always the case, not even among animals on our own planet. For example, in crocodiles and turtles, males and females are chromosomically identical. They possess exactly the same set of chromosomes with the same genes, unlike humans, who have clear genetic differences between the sexes. What determines whether a crocodile or a turtle develops female or male reproductive organs is the environmental temperature during the embryonic development. Both males and females possess all of the genes necessary to be either sex, and it is the influence of the environment that determines which genes will be expressed. The same set of genes can therefore lead to different anatomies. Now, this example might not be the most obvious and not even the most appropriate, which brings us to insects. Ants, with their different castes of workers and soldiers, and grasshoppers that can transform into locusts and form swarms, are also good examples of polyphenism in action. They are species whose individuals share the same set of genes, but these are expressed differently, producing physical variability, precisely what we can see in the kaiju. It is most likely that the polyphenism behind these monsters is completely artificial. The precursors that created the kaiju probably used a common genetic template, repressing and expressing different genes to shape these monsters according to their convenience. Leaving the genome aside, another trait common to all kaiju is their blood. Not only it is of an intense blue color, but it also becomes acidic when exposed to the air, a phenomenon that within the universe of this franchise is known as Kaiju Blue, and which is responsible for extensive environmental damage after each battle against these creatures. Now, blue blood is not something completely alien to life on Earth. A good example of this would be octopuses and horseshoe crabs. As we have seen in previous videos, the blue color of their blood is due to the fact that it transports oxygen using copper-based proteins, as this metal forms blue pigments in their blood. And the best known of these copper-carrying proteins are hemocyanins, whose colorations can actually vary quite a bit. They are not all blue. Hemocyanins have advantages and disadvantages when it comes to oxygen transport, aspects that in some way align quite well with certain kaiju traits. For example, some types of hemocyanins have a very high affinity for oxygen, which makes them more useful in low oxygen environment, such as aquatic habitats, especially at great depths. This is why animals with blue blood tend to be sea-dwelling. It is possible that the kaiju's blue blood is a necessary adaptation not only to survive in the environment in which they are manufactured, but also to endure their journey from the deep ocean floor to the surface. On the other hand, the blue color of these creatures' blood could also be closely related to its tendency to become acidic. There are certain copper-based salts that are of an intense blue color and that can at the same time become very powerful acids when exposed to the appropriate reactants. In this case, we could be talking about copper sulfate, which is not only blue but can also turn into sulfuric acid under the right conditions. And this is one of the strongest acids known. Perhaps the kaiju store or transport copper in their blood in the form of this salt. In fact, it is normal for metals circulating in the bloodstream to interact with other substances, forming salts that can serve as a buffer or a temporary storage. For example, in humans this is the case with calcium and phosphate. These two substances combine together in our blood in order to co-regulate their levels. Something similar could occur between the copper and the sulfate group in kaiju physiology. Alternatively, it is also possible that this copper is stored in some special protein. This protein could perfectly well degrade or break down when the kaiju dies, leading to the formation of copper sulfate, and from copper sulfate into sulfuric acid, which will explain the acidification of kaiju blood. Now, this ability of kaiju blood to produce powerful acids could also be used by certain variants of these creatures to grant them special abilities. For example, the capacity to spit ultra-concentrated acid as an attack. They would simply be using components already present in their blood to create a highly corrosive secretion, not very different from how humans use chlorine and hydrogen from our own bodies to synthesize hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Beyond this, the kaiju's ability to create and concentrate a strong acid in their organs could also explain the bioelectric powers we see in other variants. Depending on the definition of acid we use, one could consider acids to be substances that, when dissolved in water, form solutions deficient in electrons. I insist, this depends on the definition. There are several definitions of acid. What matters here is that under the Lewis definition, acids are substances eager to bind and accept electrons, and therefore can be used to generate an electric potential, a voltage. This is what explains why certain batteries use acids. Vehicle batteries are a good example of this, and the acid they use usually is none other than the already mentioned sulfuric acid. Thus, the bioelectric capabilities of certain kaiju are simply an extension of the acidic properties of their blood. Moving on to another element among kaiju, we have the fact that these creatures are characterized by possessing large quantities of ammonia in their bodies. Ammonia is the molecule you can see on the screen. It is a compound that contains nitrogen and that constitutes one of the main molecules derived from protein metabolism. The problem with ammonia is that it is a highly toxic substance that, in order to be eliminated from the body, requires large amounts of water, and this imposes certain limitations on life. Animals, particularly terrestrial ones, cannot eliminate ammonia directly as they would poison or dehydrate themselves in the attempt. Instead, they rapidly use this ammonia to produce urea, and animals that do this are said to have an ureotelic metabolism, a group that includes humans. Alternatively, ammonia can be converted into uric acid, and animals that do this are known as uricotelic, a group that includes, for example, birds. The kaiju instead seem to be ammonotelic. They eliminate ammonia directly from their bodies, once again aligning themselves with aquatic animals. Fish are also almost all of them ammonotelic. They eliminate ammonia directly, as living in the sea, the need for water ceases to be a major problem. Once again, we are faced with a marine trait present in these monsters. As a curious fact, the largest ammonotelic animal of all is the sunfish mola mola. It is possible or even likely that kaiju cannot survive very long without returning to the water, at least temporarily, in order to eliminate excess ammonia from their body. On the other hand, it is also possible that high concentrations of ammonia could be eliminated through urine, but above all through feces in the form of salts. This fits well with the information from the film, where we are told that kaiju excrement is one of the best fertilizers that exist. Ammonia is precisely one of the substances most commonly used to fertilize fields. Leaving this aside, in my opinion, it is possible that the precursors who created the kaiju took one or several animals native to human oceans and extensively modified them to give rise to these monsters. Now, the problem is that no vertebrate on our planet accumulates all the characteristics we see in kaiju. To begin with, there are no blue-blooded vertebrates that produce hemocyanin, but if I had to dare to suggest a life form that could have served as the basis for the creation of the kaiju, I would probably choose one of two groups of fish, coelacanths and lungfish. Like kaiju, these fish possess scales and are ammonotelic, and in the case of lungfish, they do not even depend on gills to breathe. But unlike the rest of the classes of fish, they possess a well-developed internal skeleton, with bones in the fins that are more similar to those in our own hands than to the fin bones of other fish. Both coelacanths and lungfish belong to a group called Sarcopterygians, the same group from which tetrapods evolved, including humans, of course. Another interesting similarity between kaiju and coelacanths is that both of them give birth to live young. But while coelacanths are ovoviviparous, kaiju seem to be placental due to the presence of an umbilical cord. And whatever the case, we have to keep in mind there are also kaiju with arthropod characteristics, so they are probably based in not one but several different original species, maybe forming distinct lines of kaiju or maybe all merged together in one genetic template. Now, an alternative hypothesis would be that they were derived from certain species of sauropsis such as Mosasaurus or Plesiosaurus. This hypothesis would fit better with what we are told in the film, that dinosaurs were the original kaiju, but this is based in a somewhat vague statement that maybe hints to something else. And there's also the fact that neither Mosasaurus nor Plesiosaurus were actually dinosaurs, they were their own thing. But what I'm fairly sure of is that despite having been modified, kaiju were almost certainly created based on life forms from our planet. The skeleton of these monsters, their anatomy, their physiology, and even their molecular composition aligns quite well with those of many animals on Earth, something that even extends to traits so specific like having a lymphatic system. Something that is not universal, not even on planet Earth. However, there are some traits that set kaiju apart, and the most important of these traits is having two brains. As we are told, this second brain allows them to control their huge bodies, and in the film it is stated that this is a trait that they share again with dinosaurs. But this is false. Dinosaurs did not have two brains. But in any case, we could try to interpret this in a more realistic way. Even in the human body, nervous tissues can be organized into clusters outside of the skull that fulfill different functions. We are talking about the various types of nerve ganglia, some of which are even involved in muscle function, just as occurs with the supposed second brain of the kaiju. In humans, the equivalent would probably be the spinal ganglia, but the largest ganglionic mass of neurons in our body is actually the celiac or semilunar ganglia, which controls a large portion of our abdominal organs. In octopuses, we can also see something similar. They have one brain, but also one cluster of nerve ganglia in each one of their tentacles. Contrary to popular belief, these are not brains. So, in order to give kaiju greater realism, we could interpret this supposed second brain as a significant ganglionic mass, most probably of motor functions. Now, maybe the main problem trying to explain the physiology of these creatures would be their size and the biological adaptations they would need to survive their own massive bodies. And this is something we will analyze in the next video, using as an example the Cloverfield monster. So if you're interested in how a creature could reach such colossal dimensions without being crushed by its own weight, you can subscribe so you don't miss that video. If you like my content, I can only ask you to please leave one comment with a suggestion for a future video. I really do try to take them into account, and I hope to cover everything you recommend to me over time. Now, with that said, goodbye everybody, and I'll see you all in the next video.